Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio on this Monday evening, where I feel like so much has happened today in education world. We simply had to cover it this evening, particularly, obviously, regarding OFSTED and the changes that have been made and confirmed today around the changes to the inspection regime and what's going to happen with regards to school inspection. So, if you haven't heard the news as it's been reported today, there's going to be a set of new report cards to replace the 4 overall effectiveness grades that are currently in place in schools. So the grades being outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate. And we're moving to a new report card system. And that report card system is going to have 9 areas, possibly 11, if you include early years and sixth forms. And those areas are going to be judged by a traffic light rating system that ranges from causing concern all the way through to exemplary, which many commentators today have said is the new outstanding. Is exemplary, right? And the report card, well, we'll have a look at the report card in a moment, actually. In fact, we'll look at it now. Here is the new OFSTED report card, which is going to be flashing up on so many dashboards everywhere and probably featuring in lots of promotional materials. Here it is, okay? So, along the top, obviously, we've got our causing concern, attention needed, secure, strong, and exemplary. And those are color coded. And when a school gets causing concern in the red, inspectors from this point on can only recommend that a school gets an exemplary rating. And at the other end, if you get 1 red, which is the cause for concern, then you are placed into category. And schools will be deemed to be in special measures if they have a red rating in leadership and at least 1 other area, or if safeguarding is not met. If you get 1 amber, it's going to be fun talking about these color codes, isn't it, for the next 5 years. If you get 1 amber and it's a monitoring inspection within 18 months. So that would mean that all schools that are either causing concern or have any area graded attention needed, which is amber, will get a monitoring inspection within 18 months. Ofsted are going to publish the number of SEND students and absence data, and they plan to summarize information on schools in the local area alongside the report card. And that includes absence and attendance. That's the crux of it. The other really important bit, I suppose, is that curriculum deep dives are no more. And there is going to be more of a focus on results, which, funnily enough, was the focus in the previous framework before this particular Ofsted framework came into effect. Now, there has been plenty of response to this today. Many union leaders have come out and said that this is awful. This is not the inspection reform that they wanted to see. We've had comments from Paul Whiteman, for example, saying that this isn't the sort of redesign of the inspection regime that he wanted and his union wanted. We've had comments from Daniel Kebede saying similar. There's not really been much in the way of conciliatory talk from unions on this. Most, if not all, have been very much not in favour. However, Bridget Phillipson did appear on a speech today at the Centre for Social Justice, and she had this to say.
Just like to start by recognising the tragedy of Ruth Perry's death, and I think the impetus for change that her sister, Professor Julia Waters, has brought to the system. I've spoken with Julia about the need to reform OFSTED, yes, in terms of the report card system, but also the wider reform that is required. And I know that Martin Oliver, the Chief Inspector, has started that work, but there is more that needs to happen. On the report cards in particular, I think parents are more than able to understand and to take on board greater information about what's happening within their children's school, both in terms of strengths and areas of weakness and where there is further work required on improvement. So I just fundamentally reject this idea that somehow providing more information, shining a light on areas where there is a need for improvement, but also where there is excellence, is somehow not something that parents want when all the evidence is clear that they do, but also it will provide an impetus and a drive to take forward more action within schools where we haven't seen the progress that we've needed in recent years.
Oh, we are going to have so much fun discussing this tonight. It's going to be wonderful. I've got two guests who I'll bring in just a moment's time. Before I do that, it would be remiss of me to not mention our fantastic sponsors at Teachers Talk Radio, one of which is John Catt Educational. If you're a teacher and you like reading and you like professional development, then please visit the John Catt Bookshop at johncattbookshop.com. You can benefit from a special Teachers Talk Radio discount where you can get 20% off any book on the John Catt Bookshop website by using the code JCTTR2425. Head over there. Thank you, John Catt, for supporting this show. And our other fantastic sponsor this evening is USA Study. If any of your students are considering studying in the United States, post-16 or post-18, please get in touch with USA Study. Visit them at usastudy.co.uk. They can provide everything when it comes to that application journey, from actual choices on application all the way through to the journey over to the United States itself. So if you know anybody or you have any students yourself interested, then get in touch with USA Study. And again, thank you very much to USA Study. Teachers Talk Connect is happening on the 1st of March. If you're a teacher and you haven't heard the news yet, this is our biggest free event ever. We've got Kate Jones, we've got Mr. PICT, we've got Vic Goddard on the main stage, and 50 other speakers across 6 other subject strands on the day. So if you fancy coming along, the tickets are completely free for teachers or people who work in educational institutions. So definitely check out the website for the ticketing on that. Now, back to the topic of our show, which is the changes announced by Ofsted today. And please, if you have any comments yourself during the show and you're watching this either on YouTube or on X, then you can comment live, get involved in the chat, send in your comments, and we will discuss those, or we will share those on screen if we can, as we go through the show this evening. So let's bring in our guests this evening. We've got Rob and Phil. Rob works for the Leadership Skills Foundation, and Phil is an academic at Nottingham Trent University. Welcome both. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Brilliant. Well, listen, I want to start just quickly by asking you your overarching thoughts on the changes that we've heard today, notably with regards to this new report card, which we put on screen earlier. So I'll start with Rob.
I knew you were going to start with me. The contentious one.
I know. The reason I asked you, Rob, and you know this, is because I came across one of your posts on LinkedIn where you were quite positive about it. So I wanted to find out the rationale. I wanted to find out the why. Right? I know you work within something that's around leadership and around business and so on. So I wanted to know where your rationale was, or whether it's just a personal thing.
Yeah, so I think a bit of my background, I do work for the Leadership Skills Foundation, but before that, I was a secondary school English teacher for nearly 10 years. So I've had my fair experience with Ofsted. They've been in my lessons. I've undergone that you know, pre-Ofsted night where you don't sleep, where you constantly, you're up for hours, double checking everything's resourced and planned, and I've had that experience. But I'm also a parent. I've got young children, and so my wife and I, who is also a primary school teacher and has her experience of that, we've pored over Ofsted documents. Now, when I came across the new report card system, I was aware, obviously, that there were changes being made, and I suppose the headline is, I am positive about it, but I do not think this is a panacea for all of the problems that are still to be addressed. I think this is just a step in the right direction. And I will be honest, I was quite surprised that there remains such vitriol against it.
I want to know. I want to know why you think it's a step in the right direction. So why? What's your sort of thinking there?
I mean, I think so. Last year, Ofsted did their big listen from March, and one of the things that they found was that they spoke to parents, carers, educational professionals, and they just gathered feedback on effectively what they wanted to see in Ofsted reports. And one of the things that they found from that was that one of the key findings was that the overall effectiveness grade should go, and that the reports themselves should provide a more nuanced view of a provider's strengths and areas of improvement. And this is what the system does. So obviously there are still questions that surround its efficacy, and it will kind of naturally take shape over time once this initial consultation, which I believe, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is due to end in April, once that's been completed. But I think this is a step in the right direction to seeing some of those more positive changes being implemented.
Okay. I wondered though, because you mentioned like the nuance element there, and there will be many out there who would look at it and go, the overall effectiveness grade has gone. That's been parked. However, it's essentially been, many will look at it and say it's been replaced by between 9 and 11 overall effectiveness grades. Now, okay, it may not be that one word sort of judgment and that one word thing on the sort of school gates as much, but it's still a very sort of short, sharp judgment being made. There'll be many who might look at it and say it's exactly what we've got now with the different areas that are graded. It's just that the overall effectiveness is gone, the overall judgment's gone, but the other stuff's still there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to a kind of a broader issue with the entire purpose of Ofsted, and it's a kind of a catch-22 in that you can never capture the essence of what a school is and does. It just, I mean, unless you work there or you're a student there, or I mean, even I would go as far as say, even if you're a parent, you don't really know what it's like in a school unless you're living and breathing that school environment. I know you mentioned Daniel Kebede earlier. He said it can't capture the complexity of school life, and I agree with him. But critically, neither could the other method. Again, nothing will ever be able to completely capture what it's like to be within that school environment. But again, I think that this is a little bit more nuanced. Again, it's not perfect, but I think this gives a little bit more of a kind of a tactile approach than just one of those single one-word judgments.
Got you. Well, I'll bring Phil in. Phil, do you think this provides a more nuanced approach?
Well, At one level, you could argue it does, because you're actually looking at a whole series of things explicitly. Now you're looking at nine things rather than one or two. I think the problem, as far as I see it, is from long-term experience. So I started teaching in the mid-90s. I was a head of department in a big comprehensive up until about 2005-6 when I went into HE. So I caught the front end of the self-evaluation form, and I can remember at the time this big sort of fanfare about it was trusting schools. It was about freedom. No, it wasn't. It was a micromanagement tool. It was a way basically of deciding how a school had to run itself from Whitehall, because by including certain elements on the self-evaluation form, schools had to then work in particular ways, had to collect particular types of data. And I think part of the problem over the sort of term of Ofsted is that it's created an extremely performative culture where schools are quite often forced, unless you have a very confident leader who really is confident about what they're doing, it can lead to people feeling that they have to basically follow the trail in terms of data. And my real concern with this, we won't know until the toolkits are created, and obviously it then depends whether or not the inspection toolkits are made public or not. But what I fear most is that schools will then start thinking, oh, well, we don't collect lots of data on that, or we don't really collect sufficient data on that. And what this will actually do is lead to even more performance management activity, and therefore it will lead to even more work for teachers who are already massively over the limit in terms of work. And consequently, even with the best intentions, I think this, if it's not handled carefully, could actually worsen the retention problem rather than actually help it.
Do you think it could be worse than what we've currently got?
Yes. Because the thing is that yes, schools are probably collecting data or collecting information in most of these areas already, admittedly, but it just ratchets up the stress and the pressure to make sure that you've got your back covered in every way, shape or form for each one of them. And, you know, I can foresee people sort of saying, oh, we're not good, or we're not sure how good we are at, I don't know, developing teaching. Well, okay, actually what we need to do is more observations. We need more observations to get more data to prove that we're developing teaching really well. And once you start down that route, it then just gathers a momentum, and you can end up with potentially a system where there is even more performativity than we have at the moment. And I would argue that that is a natural reaction, particularly in a sector now where head teachers are really like football managers. You know, if you get 3 or 4 good ones, then that's fine. If you get a bad one, you're out. Then ultimately head teachers are then going to have potentially more pressure on them, feel as if they have to explicitly track more. That's then going to have an impact on everybody else in the school, because that's bound to cascade down into the organization. I can see where they're coming from, and I can see the idea of trying to give people more information. But if you have created over 30 years a culture of performativity and jumping through hoops, to then sort of say, oh yeah, but the culture is not like that anymore. Now we're going to be supportive, and it's all about being, you know, nice and touchy-feely. That's going to be a really difficult sell. You don't change a culture, particularly a sector-wide culture, that quickly. And you'd need to have a good 2 or 3 years where it is really clear that all the experiences of a positive, formative process, rather than the one that we've had for the last 30 years, which is summative.
I wanted to ask, and Rob, feel free to jump back in on this as well if you want, is there's been a bit of controversy there because, for example, one of the areas on this list is attendance. And to take that as a sort of example there, Phil, of what you were saying, I mean, first off, there's that debate of how much responsibility should a school or a school leader or a teacher have the attendance within a class or school. It's now a discrete area. It's now an area within this report card. So, you know, Rob, does that ratchet up the pressure? And is that an example there? And we could probably pick through this and pick out potential other examples where it's something that it's debatable whether it's in a school's control. Or how much of it is in a school's control, how much of that responsibility and accountability should be on, you know, a school or a teacher for something like attendance. Some of the other ones, you know, like safeguarding, for example, you know, maybe that's more straightforward to look at. But I wondered whether, you know, you had a thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that, you know, schools are measured against, and I completely take on board that, you know, short of going around to the students' houses and kind of dragging them there.
Which is what a head teacher called David Scale did, if you remember. So it was reported in, I think his schools, it's either Sheffield or Doncaster. He's been on Teachers Talk Radio, actually. But he went round and sort of checked the bins to check if, you know, if people were away. I can see more of that happening, no? That sort of thing, because there'll be high pressure, particularly in that area, I think, of attendance, because Bridget Phillipson has mentioned attendance, and, you know, Rachel de Souza and other people have mentioned it. There'll be a lot of pressure in that area, and I can see again there might be some, you know, I think that one of the issues which we've talked about on Teachers Talk Radio quite a lot over the years has been around the idea that you need to make new policies and stuff to get better in one of these grades. Now, with the inclusion of something like attendance, we're thinking of new ideas, right, straight away. We're thinking about a drone that we launch from the roof of the school that sort of goes to people's houses, you know, in a half-hour cycle and hovers over and checks if cars are in drives and if, you know, if the door's been opened and so on, right? Obviously, I'm joking. But however, policies like that, maybe not as bizarre as that, but along those lines, I wouldn't be surprised maybe to see some of those, because there'll be a lot of high stakes on this.
I don't disagree. I think again, you know, attendance is a really tricky one. One of the things that I think this could potentially have some scope for, though, is if this is the metric by which we're going to assess schools, there might be scope for, you know, a kind of a year-on report by which Ofsted looks at the data for all of these different categories, and if there are outliers, for example, attendance, that suggests that that's a much wider issue that is perhaps beyond the control of schools. And I think, to be honest, we kind of perhaps already know that that's the case. But if the government has that data and it's staring them in the face and it's in black and white, and they can see in 60-70% of schools we've got a real issue with attendance, does that not put more pressure then back to the government, or, you know, Ofsted themselves, to perhaps consider this to be not a problem that is directly impacted by, you know, the schools can't do anything about it?
Rob, I think you're living in a wonderful, wonderful world, mate, where people say it might not be the school's fault, it might not be the teacher's fault. We need to elect you. We really do. Phil, do you think Rob's right? Do you think there's a hope that perhaps with attendance being included there, it could become, as Rob said, like an outlier, and then if it's some sort of outlier, they might look at that and say, no, this isn't the fault of the school?
They might do. I doubt it, but they might do. The other thing that might happen, I mean, it depends whether it come under attendance or behaviour and attitude, but what happens with things like temporary suspension? You know, how does that fit in? And I was staggered this week. I was talking to somebody who works down in the south of England, where they had a child appear at their school who had been at the school previously, and they had come back for academic respite. And it was basically that they'd been really badly behaved in the school that they normally go to. And rather than giving them a temporary exclusion, they'd sent them to this other school for academic respite. And ultimately, in reality, what that is actually about is making sure that your numbers stay okay. So one of the problems potentially that we're going to start seeing with this is that people find ways of making their data look better. I mean, people have always done that because we're in a performance.
Yeah, I was going to say, wouldn't that always have happened? I'm interested to know with this though, Phil, where you see maybe a difference or more of that happening or whatever.
I think. I mean, obviously, we don't know until it gets underway, and as I said before, a lot of it depends on what the toolkit says in terms of how things are reported, how things are actually perceived by inspectors once the system is up and running. But going on past experience, then I mean, it's the first time I've ever known Ofsted actually say, well, actually, you know what, context might be quite important. For 30 odd years, it was a case of, well, no, sorry, if your GCSE results are bad, that's because you're a bad school. And to my mind, that there's a real risk that, yes, some enlightened soul at the DfE might sort of say, well, look, there's a big cluster of problems with attendance in that area. Perhaps it's nothing to do with the school. Then again, they might not. How do we know? And ultimately, what we're then getting into, which could be a positive, is an understanding that schools can't solve all the ills of society, and that actually we need wider social policy on a number of fronts to make the lives of people in general far better. But actually, pragmatically, it's easier to blame schools, because actually that's an easier thing to do than actually admitting that there are a series of really serious underlying social problems that need to be tackled if we're going to make the situation better.
Do you think that this new format, though, improves transparency? Do you think that it or does it sort of oversimplify the more sort of complex things that are happening in schools?
I think we have to accept that any kind of reporting is going to oversimplify. I mean, you just can't get away from that.
Yeah.
There are ways.
Although if it was a, I guess what I'm saying is an alternative. If it was like, let's say it was just a narrative profile of school, like a couple of paragraphs. There was no rating or judgment or whatever. It was literally like an A4 page with 3 or 4 paragraphs on it to sort of get into what this school's like, right? And it, perhaps it would be more broad brushstroke, perhaps it could be more getting into things. I don't know, but is something like that different to this?
I mean, as I said before, it depends what the toolkit says. I mean, what you can't judge from the draft that I saw today in the video that they showed about how this will work is just how much quantitative data is going to be involved in this. And I think until we get to the stage where we can actually see the detail of that, it's very difficult to judge that. The thing is, ultimately, what I think is problematic at a base level is whatever you've got, it's still a team going into a situation that they don't necessarily understand very well. By the sounds of what they're talking about, they're still only going to be in for a day or two. So a lot of it is going to be driven off metrics that they've collected outside of the school. So what you're constantly doing is going into a process of complexity reduction, which may end up with the evidence that you're looking at bears no relationship to the reality of the organization. And if that's what you're doing, then actually why do it? Because if you've got an inaccurate view of something or an overly simplified view of something, what you're going to suggest to help that organization is frankly unhelpful. I mean, there may be broad brushstroke areas where the school can sort of say, yeah, we do need to work on that. But I would, if I'm brutally honest, I would prefer a system that is much more like Challenge Partners, where it's about a self-improving community, where schools are working collaboratively, where they're doing very much a diagnostic and formative process, rather than having an inspectorate, which is ultimately there to measure you.
I suppose the criticism that people would make of that, I'm not personally necessarily one of them, but I've seen this out there, is things where it's like a peer assessment style operation, or challenge partners, or cluster of schools that it's one sort of mate goes and chats to another one of their mates in a neighboring school or someone they know well, and then there's not genuine accountability because everyone knows everyone. It's all, now this has happened in the current framework. I know it was reported, I think it was maybe a couple of months ago, that somebody from, I don't know, near the top of an academy chain had been an inspector on the neighboring schools or something 10 times. It was along those lines. But I'm saying if that would be the criticism of that, the whole system would become pally, and then certain things like safeguarding or other things would be missed.
All I'd say is I finished being a chair of governors in the summer. I'd actually been on that governing body for 12 years for an absolutely brilliant school in the Midlands in really difficult circumstances. They were members, they are still, as far as I know, members of challenge partners. The data that we got back, the things that we could actually feed in to try and develop improvement within the school was far more useful and far more developmental from them than it was from Ofsted. And in the sense that it was developmental for the senior leaders as well, but it was also developmental for staff. And my experience certainly from that, and I totally accept there's probably great variability, and if you were moving over to that system, you'd need checks and balances in it. But actually, as a self-improving system, my experience is that it is way more useful for schools than Ofsted.
Rob, I wanted to ask you around the colour coding, which I know Adam Boxer described as Nando's memory on X. And I've seen other people describe, talking similarly. Does that colour coding help to make it clearer, or could it be a stigma? I can already hear you're in the red.
Mm-hmm.
I can already hear you're in the red. You're in the red, aren't you? Yeah. Are you in amber? Yeah. Are you in dark green or light green? Oh, we're in light green, but we're hoping to move to dark green in the next couple of years. I can already hear it.
I mean, it's one of those things that I don't know whether you're ever really going to get away from. I think it serves its function. I mean, at the end of the day, Ofsted reports, if we're considering them from the point of view of people who are not in education, it's something that is very visually clear as to what the kind of overall judgment is. So from that point of view, it works.
I mean, I suppose it would be used. I don't know this, but I can imagine it would be used in the NHS or in the police and stuff. I'd imagine. I don't know that for. I'm literally plucking ideas out of the air. But
there are similar systems in place used by the CQC, which is the sort of obviously the regulatory body that aligns more with healthcare.
I think the issue is, and by the way, both jump in on this. One of the issues is that reliability of the judgments on education, because education is such a tricky thing to be able to evaluate and judge. I mean, the fact they're coming in for a very short period of time to do it, it comes back to, is it possible to judge a school on data?
No.
Is it? I mean,
no. In my opinion, it isn't. It gives you an indication.
I agree.
I can remember I did a few lectures a few years back where I talked about some of this stuff, and I described it as working with the shadows. And I used the analogy of a Japanese shadow puppet theatre. That actually what data will do is give you those shadows, but actually the richness, the colour, the detail, you don't get because you need so much more. And therefore, yes, it might give you a general overview of how a school's doing. It might generally give you an idea of the direction it's going in, but you will lose so much. And that's that's one of the things that worries me, in addition to the fact that I still come back to this idea that to try and fill in the gaps, to try and fill in the information so that they're on the front foot, schools could end up just collecting far more data, and that in a job that is already unsustainable, in a sector where it appears that it's increasingly difficult to get head teachers because people don't want to have that level of stress. Introducing this could potentially make the situation far worse than it is at the moment.
I mean, obviously, we've had the high profile case in the last couple of years of Ruth Perry, but even since then, I mean, just on a purely anecdotal level, you know, I've seen maybe 2 or 3 head teachers quit, or sort of, you know, I wouldn't necessarily use the word forced out without knowing the inner details, but you know, you see it quite a bit actually of head teachers just having to walk away, and without sort of again, purely anecdotal, but you look at some of them, you look at who they are. I mean, there's a few that I know personally, not very, very well, but I know them enough to be able to say that they are probably excellent professionals, who work extremely hard and are, you know, to say, you know, how good someone is at a job, I think that's maybe overstepping it a little bit, but in terms of how professional they are and how they go about things, I'm almost certain they're very, very good. They're leaving. So, you know, you look at this sort of situation and it's quite difficult because someone like Julia Waters, the sister of Ruth Perry, she was pushing for something much more radical. And there were many people, I mean, she actually came out, weirdly though, and I say weirdly, that's the wrong word, but she actually came out and said, you know, I think we need to sort of move forward with what we can and change what we can and move forward. Now, I haven't seen what she said about today yet. And actually, I've invited her on Teachers Talk Radio. She may come on at some point to have her own say on this. But ultimately, you know, is it enough based on what's happened? You know, is this a repackage, or is this sort of, you know, were most people looking for something a bit more radical and a bit more, you know, interesting, I suppose? It's more a discussion point than a.
I think I mean, at the end of the day, everyone that works with children in that kind of educational setting, you know, whether that's teachers or you know, from the kind of educational charity sector where I'm from, or Ofsted or senior leaders, whoever it is, I mean, we all come to it from different sides of the plate, but we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, if I can combine 2 idioms in the same sentence. You know, we all want what's best for students, and, you know, ideally better retention in the teaching profession. We want a more supportive, sustainable education system. The question really is, how do we evaluate the centres effectively? And you know, again, I agree. You know, the steps that have been put in place today are not the be all and end all. But I think they are a step in the right direction.
But is this a step, or is it?
Well, you know, I mean, that's the question.
I didn't personally see it as a step. I saw this as it, but I could be wrong on that. I could be wrong.
Well, I mean, I suppose the reason I'm seeing it as a step, and you know, the word consultation is loaded. You know, could just be a foregone conclusion, but the consultation, they're currently open to taking consultation on this. Now, I mean, it's hard because obviously, if you are a senior leader, if you are a teacher, you have got enough on your plate. You know, you don't need to be writing to Ofsted and kind of doing that. Obviously, do if you can find an iota of time in your day. But I think it just speaks to, I think, a much broader question about how we assess. I mean, interestingly, this kind of report card system, aligns quite strongly with the kind of how schools assess their students, using that kind of structured framework to kind of measure progress against a set of criteria. I mean, that's how we track progress in schools. So from that point of view, I mean, are we saying that it's okay for students to track their, to kind of track them and gather data in that way, but are we not holding schools to the same account?
Brilliant conversation so far. There's so much more I want to talk about in the last 25 minutes or so. But before we do that, just another shout out to John Catt Education, our sponsor on the show tonight. If you are a teacher who likes reading, then look no further than the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com. Use JCTTR2425 to get 20% off any book on there. Thank you, John Catt, for supporting Teachers Talk Radio. USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through the college application journey. If any of them are interested in going to the USA, usastudy.co.uk for that. Guys, I wanted to ask you next, could this new report card system lead to a blame game situation on particular staff or departments or members of senior leadership teams responsible for certain things? Or has that always been the case? Or does it, because there's more areas and because there's, this sort of report card system and whatever, does that create more of a, you're responsible for that area, you're responsible for that area, we got red in that area, but we got green in that area?
So I think the way that I approach this, last year I did a research project with some schools in the Midlands, where we were looking at bringing about organisational change in schools in a very different way. And one of the real problems in schools, in hospitals, in universities, etc., is that we've created a really awful culture of hyper change. There's too much change going on at all times within organisations now because there are so many briefs that you're trying to meet. But there's only so much change that you can actually embed and normalize over a particular period of time. And therefore, I've argued in the past, and I still argue, that we see a lot of zombie innovation in education. And what I mean by that is it exists in plans, it exists in evaluation, but it doesn't exist in day-to-day change practice because people are just trying to assimilate too much. And my fear with something like this in a large secondary school, obviously it'd be different in many primary schools, but my real worry with this in this sense in large secondary schools is you'll end up with an assistant head for each one, or you might have a couple of areas for each assistant head. They then have to make sure that that area moves forward because that will be in their performance management. And therefore, before you know where you are, as a head of department, you'll have 10 of these things flying down at you every year. You've got to deal with every single one of them. You've got to demonstrate how your practice has got better in each of those and how it's embedded. That's just impossible. That is just far too much work. But that I would imagine, I mean, I'd be really interested to see going forward how people react, how head teachers react. But I would imagine they'll feel almost a natural pressure to be able to demonstrate to Ofsted coming in that every single one of these areas has a plan, is being moved forward, that the school's on it. And that creates an environment where you're setting yourself up to fail. Because, as I say, you cannot assimilate that amount of change within your practice over the course of 12 months. I mean, one example of how bad the system already is, I was talking to somebody last summer because I was doing a presentation on this very different approach to change that I've been working with. And she works at a large secondary school in the Midlands and said, well, yeah, our improvement plan last year was 130 pages long. Now, how the hell can one organisation assimilate that amount of improvement activity? And perhaps part of the problem, we don't know obviously, but is part of the problem, this will actually exacerbate that.
Rob, any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that potential. I think that I've certainly worked in schools where there is that kind of knee-jerk reaction to the latest kind of policy, and suddenly everyone's kind of got this focus. And I think that kind of constant, it's interesting to say about constant change, that is an issue in schools. I think by the time something is in place, it's out of date, it's out of fashion. Teaching itself and education is very faddy. We like or seem to like, as educators, we like to reinvent the wheel. Well, I say like delicately, but we seem to do it quite a lot. But I think none of those things have happened yet. And I've put me down as an optimist, but I think the other thing as well is arguably if those schools need to make those changes, not necessarily in 130 odd pages, as Phil said, but if they need to make those changes, and if they are causing concern or there is attention needed in those areas, then surely that is I don't want to say it's a good thing, but that flags to the school that they need to address that as a matter of urgency. Again, I appreciate that safeguarding on the new report is a different. It has its own little subcategory, but again, just to use the example that Ofsted put out today, achievement. If their achievement is needing attention and is in that amber bracket, then that is something that needs to be addressed one way or the other. And I think by the risk you fall into is just to say, well, it's going to cause loads of work, it's going to cause loads of stress, teachers are leaving, and they are, and I get it because I was one of them, so I'm completely I'm on the side of that. However, I think if that does need to be addressed, then it needs to be addressed for the good of the students.
Phil, any thoughts on that? Because I mean,
well, two things really. Yes, it does, but I come back to my original point. You might have 4 or 5 areas where you need to improve, but you have to be honest, and in some cases, it might take 3, 4, 5 years to do that.
Absolutely.
And again, it depends whether there's a major culture shift at Ofsted, because in the past, I mean, I go back to the mid 2000s when people like Jane Perryman were doing research on the impact of poor Ofsted grains in schools. It's a case of, we're back in 6 months, and it better be better in 6 months. And everybody's running around like the Keystone Cops for 6 months, trying desperately to mitigate the worst of what's happened. That is not a useful, successful, formative system. So yes, I agree. This could be good in those ways, but you'd need a seismic cultural shift within Ofsted to make that happen.
I agree.
And I mean, the way that potentially you could do it is say, right, perhaps get rid of the name, but actually go back to the old style HMIs, because the old style HMIs did come into the school and did give formative support to help you in that direction. And I think that kind of system where there are people who are in the local area, they understand the local schools, yes, they're involved in inspections, but then they're the ones who are coming in on a regular basis and formatively helping that kind of thing improve, which actually the better mats are already good at doing. That's the kind of thing that you need. My fear is that you get something like this, they sort of come in and sort of say, right, you've got 4 oranges and a couple of reds, you're not really doing very well. We'll be back in 18 months, make sure they're green. And then everybody just sort of runs around like headless chickens, trying to make sure that their data looks good enough so that they pass muster. Is that improvement, or is that actually just that they've worked out what they need to do to make the data look right to get green? And that's the other problem with this as well. Does it bring true normalized change that makes the organization better, or do you just bring people in who are good at sort of putting a gloss on it and making it look good enough to get through and jump over the hurdle and then be left alone for a while?
That is the risk. I think just to come back, Phil, I think there's the rise. Is it the rise teams? the regional improvement for standards and excellence team was announced. I think today. They are the kind of the group of experts, and again, I've done enough CPD at schools where, you know, educational experts who haven't been in a classroom for, you know, 20 years are suddenly the new educational gurus. However, I mean, what do you think about the kind of the implementation of this? I don't know whether is it the Rise team or the Rise Collective. This group of high performing school leaders, academy heads, who are going to actively work with schools in order to try and drive up that attainment.
It very much depends, in my opinion, on how they're coming in to do that. So there may be people who are extremely good at that, who are very thoughtful, understand the context, and try to work with the schooling that's going to work for the school. There's always the danger that somebody will come in and sort of say, well, our model works really well, you ought to do that.
Absolutely.
And don't really take the context into account. So I think, to my mind, it feels like a lot of this has been quite rushed. And I understand one of, you know, that there may be political imperatives to do it quickly.
Absolutely.
But given that this is going to roll forward for at least the next 5 years, what I would have preferred to have seen is a much wider consultation and a longer period of time really thinking through the ramifications of this and really thinking through what is it we want for our system. Because it feels to me that if we're not careful, this just becomes deck chair shuffling. It's basically leaving the system as it was, but putting a bit of gloss on it, looking at a few extra areas, but the underlying process, the underlying culture doesn't shift. And I would argue that if we have an eye on recruitment and retention, if we have an eye actually on things like student mental health, which is obviously extremely poor at the moment, is this part of a puzzle that does need radical change and not being seen in its own right? I think one of the other problems in government generally, and it's not a poke at this government, I think governments generally have been very bad at this for a long time, is that they're all so incredibly siloed. And I would guess even with something like this, a little bit of the DFE has looked at it, other bits of the DFE are working on the curriculum review, other bits of the DFE are working on recruitment and retention, and nobody's saying, oh, hang on a second, these all link together, don't they? Actually, we ought to be looking at this in the round and thinking about system change and how these fit in. And as a consequence, we just get sort of constant piecemeal change where the whole thing is just constantly misfiring. So, you know, I hope you're right. I hope this is put forward, and that what Ofsted then do is offer a genuinely positive, formative set of processes to support schools, that regional experts can come in and help schools with the kind of needs that they have. Unfortunately, my experience of the last 20 or 30 years in education is that just is not the culture. And therefore, I'm just very, very wary that this will continue to be very, very performative.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the whole parents thing, because obviously Bridget Phillipson said today that, you know, she said something like, you know, to say parents don't want this more detailed report card thing so they can look at each area and so on. I mean, would be wrong, because she's saying they do based on research. And, you know, I suppose the question is, will this give them a clearer understanding of school performance, or will it just cause alarm in particular areas? You know, I don't know.
I think it very much depends on the parent. I mean, I've always found this sort of element about, you know, school choice a bit of a red herring anyway. You might have school choice. You might want to look at reports and think about school choice if you live in London, where you might have a whole series of schools very close to you. I live in rural Lincolnshire, so I can look at a school and sort of say, oh, I don't really like the look of that. I want to go somewhere else. Oh, it's 19 miles away, and they don't do transport. How's that going to work? So in a sense, I think there are probably pools of the country where school choice is a serious issue. in most parts of the country, it really isn't. I think, and therefore, you know, you might look at the report, but actually its utility is perhaps lower. I think there's a danger that schools in hard pressed areas who are not only doing all of this core work, but are now actually providing a whole series of other things. I mean, some research that we published at the end of last year, we've developed this idea of what we're calling leadership by social triage, where schools are picking up all kinds of social problems that aren't their responsibility, but there's nowhere else for families to go, and then are working out what they can deal with in-house and what they have to shift on and try and get help with. So that doesn't come up in something like this. And the danger that I see is that a school might get a couple of oranges and a red, and then you might get a vocal minority of parents who are then really hammering the school when actually it's doing the best it can in really difficult circumstances. And I think it'll only be a matter of time before national newspapers are basically sort of saying there's 10 things, we'll call a red 1, we'll call a black 5, and we'll give a grade point average for schools. And there you go, yours is a 3.3 or something like that. You know, this kind of thing looks as if it will be useful. It might genuinely be useful to some parents, but I would even question how many parents actually read Ofsted reports. I wouldn't be surprised if quite a few don't. They just send their kids to the local school and they want them to be happy and they want them to feel at home at school and they want them to do well. And they see that as the responsibility of the school. And really, my 2 kids are now grown up. I never looked at an Ofsted report when they were at school. They just went to the local primary school, they went to the local secondary school, and we supported them, and the school supported them as best they could.
I mean, just flipping back to the card itself, I'll tell you the one, just from my looking at it today, that I think is going to be the one that people look at and go, well, if that's the one, that's the one. And I think, based on commentary from Martin Oliver as well in the past, it's probably going to be achievement, the exam results, the outcomes there. Now, the way that Ofsted, I guess, came out with this new framework we've had, was 2019 to move away from that sort of cut and thrust, your results are poor, your Ofsted grades poor, and maybe much less around like the way, you know, the quality of education, the curriculum path, what they're learning, how they're learning it, etc. We've moved more towards that. I wonder whether this is a shift back towards that. I mean, that is something when Martin Oliver took position that people sort of said, yeah, he's going to move the dial back to, you know, pre-2019 again. Don't know whether that achievement's going to become, you know, the one that people will look at, and then I don't know, make judgments based on that. Because if you get, if I can just see sort of scenarios where achievement is exemplary or strong, maybe other factors are secure, and that becomes the one that people almost look at. If you see what that's like, the headline.
I think do
you see what I mean? Like, that's the one where people say our achievement is exemplary, and the rest sort of, it's not that it doesn't matter, but I could see maybe people nitpicking the one that they want to, and I could see that one having that hyper value because of the way things are now set up towards exam results.
I think it depends. I mean, like Phil said, I think it depends on what, well, on a variety of different factors, and you know, geographical location being one of them. You know, like Phil. I mean, I live in the Cotswolds, in the middle of nowhere. You know, my children went to the local primary school, and you know, but I still read the Ofsted report. I mean, perhaps that's because I'm kind of from that background and I was kind of naturally interested in it anyway. But I think a lot of the parents that I speak to or have spoken with on the playground at my own children's schools, they too have read have read the Ofsted report. Now, again, admittedly, they're of a sort of a similar age to me. Maybe this kind of newer generation of parents are more engaged because they've kind of, it's kind of easier to access Ofsted reports online. You can follow them on LinkedIn and Twitter and or X or whatever. It's easier to kind of have those updates. They're more readily available. I watched Martin Oliver on YouTube this morning and talking about the new report card. Even 10 years ago, I wouldn't have done that. So I think the fact that it's more accessible now is perhaps suggests that more people are going to engage with it. Now, whether achievement, rather, I'm just looking at them now, whether achievement is the kind of the standout or not, I think it very much depends on the child, who it is that is going to that school. If your child is very, very, very well behaved, they turn up, they do their lessons, they're kind of have a flair for school, they enjoy school, they engage, then actually you might not worry too much about the achievement overall, because you might assume that they're naturally going to achieve anyway. You might look actually at the behavior and the attitudes, for example, and discover that actually the behavior is poor, and that's what the school focuses. I think there's such a variety of factors, and I think it's difficult to kind of just say, well, it could be this and it could be that, and it depends on this and it depends on that. I think, again, ultimately, this is not perfect, but it tries to kind of narrow. I think it's a narrowing down, despite it not being a single word judgment and actually having a lot more options. But I think it does kind of try to put those data points, if you like, into those categories, so it gives schools an understanding and hopefully a clearer idea of what they need to do to improve.
I was going to ask as well, just to finish off around, I know this was an area, again, sort of 5 years ago, that got a lot of attention. Could this system really discourage schools in challenging areas? Because I think we touched on this at the beginning about areas that are more out of a school's control, right? And for example, curriculum is an area that technically is more of a level playing field, because any school in any area can create a curriculum that is suitable for the students in that school, is exciting, is invigorating, is all the other words that you want to throw out. Any school anywhere can technically create that and get, I guess, an exemplary rating for the curriculum. Whereas many of those other areas, teaching, behavior, attendance, personal well-being, all these other ones, it's not rocket science to look at that and say that's going to be more difficult for certain schools to achieve. Now, Ofsted have said they're going to take more account of contextual factors, and they're going to publish some of those contextual factors and all the rest of it. But it must be a worry for some school leaders, I would think, particularly ones in more challenging areas, that they have a bigger challenge.
I think again, it comes down to this idea of what is the culture that they're going to foster. So yes, you can take context into account, but going back to what we were talking about achievement, is context taken into account to the extent that even if you have quite poor results, you could be a green because of the context that you're in. So is it that much context that is actually being included in judgments? And then on top of that, again, I come back to this whole issue of the fact that to make this work and for it to be positive, and for people in really challenging circumstances, really challenging contexts, to feel like they're on a level playing field, it just has to be far more formative. It just has to be far much more about focusing on how things can be taken forward, the kind of external help that schools might need and can gain if they have got problems. But our experience over the last 20 or 30 years is if you're not very good, you get beaten with a stick. And particularly head teachers regularly lose their jobs because they haven't had a good Ofsted outcome. Yeah. And to me, that sometimes is probably fair, but in the vast majority of cases probably is very unfair. And ultimately, I would want to be confident that the system and the culture within the system has changed enough that kind of process doesn't continue.
I agree, and I'm trying to see this through the lens of optimism. Again, this is not the be all and end all, but I think the noises that we're hearing from Ofsted so far, whether they actually follow through is another question. But the noises that we're hearing so far from Ofsted seem to be positive. They are talking generally, and again, how and whether this plays out is another question, about the measures to be put in place to support the school as opposed to beating them with a stick. Now, again, whether they actually follow through with that remains to be seen. But in my opinion, so far, so good.
I think it'd be great if that happens. I think it would take a huge amount of retraining. Two colleagues at NTU, Rachel Harding and Andrew Clapham, have actually done some research over the last year and a half on looking at a load of the evidence from things like the Education Select Committee and the inquiry over Ofsted, and have had a huge amount of evidence coming in from particularly head teachers and senior leaders in schools, to the extent that Rachel actually had to take a bit of time out because her mental health was suffering just because of the sheer volume of really harrowing stories coming out from people in schools. Now, if that is the culture that has become embedded at Ofsted, to then flip that into a very positive, formative culture is going to take one giant shift to make sure that when the inspectors come in, they're doing it in a positive way, and that the report card is about, as I keep saying, this sort of diagnostic formative tool to help people improve. That just hasn't happened up until now. So I hope you're right, but I must admit, just on long-term experience, I'm quite skeptical.
Yeah, I'd take that on board.
Right, guys, we've run out of time, but it's been a really, really good conversation. So thank you, both of you, very, very much for giving up a bit of your Monday evening to talk about Ofsted. Really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, just to round things up here, if you want to listen back to this, it'll obviously be available as a podcast, probably a little bit later on through Teachers Talk Radio, through the usual channels. Thank you very much to over 1,000 people who've watched the show live, and to those people who've engaged with it as well while we've been on air. And obviously, if you're watching this back and you've got this far, thank you very much indeed as well. Listen, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this all plays out. And certainly, I'm sure there'll be much more Teachers Talk Radio content around how this is all gonna look in the next few years. So, thank you very much. Please like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube or anywhere else. And a big thanks to John Catt and USA Study for supporting the show this evening. And I will see you next week at 6 p.m. Cheers, everyone.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.